whole plot line in perfect sequence, and I say, no, that's not what the book is about. What is the book really getting at, right? So I hope that gives you at least a sense of what it's really about. Okay, so I'm going to read from a portion of my book. Again, I'm going to read for a short amount of time, and then we'll get to your questions. This is a portion of the book where I have taken, I take my first formal steps in becoming Jewish. I happened to take a world religions, well, let me back up. First of all, I was raised in a Southern Baptist family, but my parents kind of deviated from that a little bit. So I was raised actually in a Methodist church, but decided when I was 13 years old that I could not join my confirmation class on stage and become baptized, because I just knew at that point, even at that young age, even before that, like I remember being a very little girl and thinking, you know, I love these people, but this is not who I am. So I sort of fell away from the church at that point. And then when I was 19 years old, because I was still seeking some kind of answers, some kind of foundation, some kind of framework for this, my own spiritual identity, I took a world religions course at the University of Houston. And then from that, I took a course on Judaism with Rabbi Jeff Kleinman at the University of Houston, who also ran the Hillel organization. And he, to his eternal credit, he did not turn me away. He could have very easily said, you really don't worry about becoming Jewish or whatever, but you'll see this in this section of the book that he instead turned toward me and said, you know, this could be an option for you. The course on Judaism was taught by Rabbi Jeff Kleinman, a tall, warm-hearted man who required all his students to visit a local synagogue once during the semester and write about their experience. The day after I turned in my written response, Rabbi Kleinman and I happened to reach the classroom at the same time. It was well before the others arrived, and he stopped me at the door. "Ruth, your response was excellent," he said. "I mean, really, it blew me away." "Thank you." I was glad to find him alone. Rabbi Kleinman held the door for us, and we walked into the large, empty classroom. "I want to learn more about Judaism," I announced. I blurted this to his back. Rabbi Kleinman turned to face me, a cheerful bemusement sweeping over his face. "I mean, for myself," I continued, "not just for the class." Rabbi Kleinman studied me for a moment. "Come to Hillel." Hillel was the Jewish student organization on campus, part sanctuary, part student hangout. Kleinman oversaw it. I began attending Friday night services there, and that year my circle of friends became increasingly Jewish. On Rosh Hashanah, a fellow student invited me to her family's synagogue for the celebratory Shabbat. She told me about the apples dipped in honey, poked fun at the book of life and death, and explained how the ram's horn was blown like a trumpet at the end of the service, blown for as long as the person had breath to sustain the ancient instrument. As foreign as it all was so much of the service in Hebrew, something in me relaxed. In the coming months, the further into Judaism I traveled, the more it struck me how comfortable I was with my Jewish friends, Rabbi Kleinman, the Friday evening services, the content of the class. I began to consider that there had been a reason I refused confirmation at Wildwood Methodist Church. My sense of God, much of which I had felt all my life but had rediscovered at the Rothko the year before, was Jewish. Had I always been this way? Had I been born, as the young man standing outside Hillel said, a Jewish soul to a Christian family? What was that word again? How I wished I could remember it. Or was this whole situation unspeakably inappropriate? How could I claim a culture of which I knew almost nothing, a culture to which I had zero ancestral right? It left me feeling squeamish, but here is my undeniable reality. Among Jews, I was home. I had to talk to Rabbi Kleinman. I found him in his office. "What brings you here, Ruth?" He was cheerful as usual, but that day I did not return his smile. I tried to think very carefully about the words I wanted to say. When spoken, finally, would they sail out of my mouth like a boat? Would they ferry me away from Christianity for good? Not being confirmed was one thing, but this was different. What about my own heritage? What about the people I loved? My family, my grandparents, my Southern Baptist grandmother, my namesake. I want to become Jewish. The rabbi's smile faltered. Ah, I was wondering if you'd come to me about that. I think I already am Jewish, I said. I'm sorry, I know how that sounds. How much time do you have before graduation? What does time have to do with it? One more semester. It's not enough, Ruth. Not enough? Conversion takes at least a year. I was speechless. I kept thinking of all the people I'd seen saved at church in less than a minute. Rabbi Kleinman continued, most sponsoring rabbis believe converts should not only regularly attend synagogue, but should know Jewish history and culture as well, and at least enough Hebrew to get through services. And those are the liberal ones, Ruth, the reform rabbis like me. All this takes a great deal of time, more than you'd think. He paused, gesturing to the books lying open on his desk. Look, I'm ordained and I'm still learning. The learning never stops. By this point, the bewilderment on my face must have been so clear and shining that Rabbi Kleinman had no choice but to power through the rest of his thoughts. Above all, Ruth, conversions only take place when you both, you and your sponsoring rabbi, agree that you are ready to enter the covenant. The process takes tremendous commitment. Stunned that conversion could possibly take years, I meandered in and out of the rest of the conversation as best I could. Eventually, Kleinman asked about my plans for graduate school. As soon as you settle into Purdue, find a rabbi, he advised. If you were here longer, I would be happy to sponsor you. But 4 months, he shook his head. That's okay, I said, suddenly keen to exit. Thank you for your time. As I gathered my things to leave, I could feel the rabbi's eyes on me. You know, you are a bit different, he said. I looked back at him. We don't get many people like you. Most people convert because they're marrying a Jew. Really? How does that fit into what you just said about being ready, about this covenant business? It's a tricky issue, Kleinman acknowledged. Increasingly, congregations are accepting interfaith families, but officiating a wedding between a Jew and a non-Jew, that's tough. Intermarriage remains a contested issue. Some view it as a dire threat, others as an unfortunate watering down of one's faith and culture. Others even see it as an outright betrayal. According to the most extreme version, interfaith marriage is accomplishing what Hitler could not. For a second, he was lost in thought. Anyway, something to consider as you go forward. Joe's face surged to the front of my mind. Recently, he had emailed a picture from Michigan Tech, where he was now in his senior year. Physics Student of the Year, the subject line read. I had opened it immediately. The snapshot showed Joe and another student jointly receiving the university's award. Joe smiling, showing all those crammed together teeth, his sleeves rolled up, his skin tanned from playing outside soccer. A dull ache flashed through my chest. We were 6 months into a long distance relationship, when we both knew was worth it. Thank you. And we can move on to the Q&A portion now.
We can start with the questions that you and I submitted to you that we had, or we actually just had one come through on the chat if you wanted to start with that.
Sure, let me take a look at it.
It was actually just submitted to me. It said,
okay.
Your parents seemed to be supportive of your conversion to Judaism, even going to their local synagogue often. Can you comment on this?
Sure. So it's important to realize that, well, first of all, despite being raised in a pretty strict Southern Baptist and military, my dad's father was a commander, a naval commander. And he, despite all of that training, my dad sort of rebelled, right? He was supposed to go to school for engineering. Instead, he decided to major in philosophy. And he had a complicated history with and relationship with Christianity, right? He never really left it completely, but he did deviate, right? He took a more liberal version, and you know, and chose chose to raise us in a Methodist church, which is far more open and welcoming in some ways than some of those Southern Baptist traditions. But he was, more than anything, he was a philosophy professor. And to philosophy professors, doubt is sacred, right? Doubt is the sign of an active mind. So one of the things that we would do is we would talk about these difficult parts of Christianity, and how does this fit with that, and how does it sort of fall apart at the edges over here. These were our dinner conversations. So I was raised not only by my dad doing this, but my mom also engaging in this kind of banter at the dinner table. So I was raised with a priority placed on making your own mind up. And I would say that I think in large part, the reason why my parents are so supportive is that they recognize that I have made my mind up. I have made that journey. I have, I went through the entire conversion process. And so they have been supportive, and they continue both to visit the tiny little synagogue in Alpena, Michigan, which, so cool. I just saw a video of that posted on the JHSM website recently. And I thought, oh, I love that. And not only do they offer their presence to that, to the Jews of Alpena, they've made some really wonderful friendships, and they also support it, in terms of funding and trying to keep up the synagogue building itself. So I don't know if that answered your question, but.
Can you expand upon your decision to convert to Judaism as a young adult, and go a little bit more into what your family's reaction was, and whether or not they were supportive of this decision?
Sure. So I think most everyone that I know, and this was something that I thought a lot about while I was writing this book, most everyone that I know has some kind of cultural religious identity. This is the religion that you were, raised with as a child. Sometimes in some people's lives, it's at the periphery, right? Other people, it's like it was the center of their family life. It was everything that they did was central to that religion, right? But so you have that cultural identity, which may or may not be in sync with your actual spiritual identity, right? So it's interesting to think of those two things as actually separate, right? And in many people's lives, they take what they've had, right? They take that cultural religious identity and they say, yeah, you know what, that does fit me in a spiritual way. I use this as my foundation, as my framework when things become unbearable, when things become difficult, or when I want to give thanks, when I want to become a better person and a kinder person. This is my framework for doing so. But that was not true in my case. Like I referred to earlier, I remember, so my daughter Rivka is 6 years old right now. And I remember being her age and being in these large family functions full of Southern Baptists and thinking, I really love these people, and yet I am not one of them, right? And so thank God I had my dad and my mom, who were a little bit more flexible. And what's interesting is my dad, he has come around to supporting it. But despite that, all of that dinner table back and forth debating, doubt, and the huge emphasis on literacy he brought to my life, he actually had a really hard time with it, because I think he had his own complex relationship with Christianity, and yet he was able to reconcile it and stay, right? So I took it in a different direction. I was never able to reconcile it. And in fact, I didn't want to reconcile it. I wanted to say that is my cultural religious identity, but that is not who I am spiritually. So he came around though slowly and became involved in the Alpena synagogue. But the people beyond my nuclear family, my cousins, my aunts and uncles, some of them have been very supportive. Some of them have been very quiet, and some of them have actually surprised me in saying, you know, there are so many young people now where if for whatever reason they have a problem with the religion that they were, you know, brought up with, they just leave and they stop. They just stop their spiritual practice and their spiritual seeking. And I'm just glad that you found something that works for you. And that's true for so many young people. Increasingly, unaffiliated status is going way up in the United States. So I think probably those Southern Baptists who maybe 40 years ago would have said, "Oh, you're taking the wrong steps," right? Are now in a position of saying, "You know what? I'm young-ish now. I'm not young, young-ish person who has found something that works for you, and I'm happy for you." So. And please feel free to cut me off if my answers are like too rambly.
Not at all. Being one of the few Jews in your area and not having been born into the religion, did you find yourself questioning your decision to become Jewish and to carry out traditions and rituals that keep the culture? And sort of in addition to that, when you live somewhere that does not have a synagogue or a cemetery or a Jewish community, what becomes central to that religious practice and observance and keeping up of the culture when you're missing sort of a tenet that, you know, in our area is so central to keeping it up?
Right. So at this point in my life, at this point in my kid's life, Judaism is this curious homespun marvel for them, right? And it's something, you know, we do things like we keep Shabbat, right? So every Friday night, whether or not we've had time to bake challah, we have a challah plate that we put in the middle of our table. We light candles, we say blessings. And then one of the things that I've started doing, and this kind of ties into Passover, is we have this ritual of going around the table and talking about our dayenus, right? The things, so dayenu translates to Hebrew to mean it would have been enough and yet. Right. So what are you thankful for in your life? What specifically have you noticed that you are just so glad to have in your life this week? And it's been really wonderful lately because my kids are getting to this really interesting age where they can interact with those conversations in really interesting ways. And they'll often like say, "And this is what I'm not thankful for." Right? Sometimes it turns into Festivus, but so we keep Shabbat. The other thing that I do with my kids, so we celebrate. We observe Yom Kippur, we celebrate Hanukkah and Passover. But the other thing in terms of those daily or weekly observances that I do, that I've done since my kids have been born, is I sing every night to them in Hebrew, and I sing the songs that I remember from services, so that when and if, I don't know when the pandemic is going to be over, right? But my kids are just reaching the point where they are, they can travel well now, right? So we could probably start making trips to Grand Rapids, for instance, and start engaging in that synagogue, which has a lot of younger families. But I want them to know that some of those songs, when they walk in the building, I want them to be familiar with Hebrew as a language, even if I don't always know exactly the translation. I want them to know the sound of Hebrew and to feel at home with that. And so those are some of the ways that I observe. I have to say it's more of a daily and a weekly thing than it is like I go out of my way to observe these X, Y, and Z holiday. We do some of that, but it's more of a regular presence. And I'll end that answer by saying that framed in my house is the document that I signed when I converted, right? And sometimes it's up on the wall, and sometimes I stop and I read it and I think, like, those are some very significant commitments I've made, right? To the people of Israel, to the land of Israel, and to raise my children as Jews, right? And how have I done that? So I do question myself all the time. I try to figure out, how can I do this? And those are some of the ways that I've discovered, but I'm also, like I said, I look forward to the time where we can travel a little bit and get down to the Grand Rapids congregation.
What was the adjustment like from growing up in Texas to residing in rural Michigan? Did you find any similarities between the community you grew up in and Ludington? And, what were some of the differences you saw?
Oh, everything was so different. I mean, if you think about the United States, one of the things that continues to astound me, and I think one of the reasons why we've had such a difficult time responding effectively to the pandemic, is because we essentially live in a huge landmass, right? Where states do have their own kind of culture. And Texas has a very different cultural feel than Michigan. And even Houston has a different cultural feel than a lot of the rest of Texas. Often students will ask me, like, where's your accent? Well, I grew up in one of the most diverse places in the United States. I don't have an accent, right? A lot of people who grow up in those urban areas in Texas don't have an accent. But in terms of differences, it was just, it's very quiet here, right? And I feel like I really embraced that over time. But at first it was very eerie, the quiet of the country. I think in terms of things that remain similar, I made some lifelong wonderful friendships in Texas. And if you read my book, you'll read about another lifelong friendship that I've made here. So if I can say there's a similarity, probably the only one I can say for sure is that there are good people anywhere you go, including rural West Michigan, that will help you navigate all of that uncertainty and change in life. And I'm grateful for that.
Did you find that living in a rural community, you felt isolated? Or once you connected with your neighbors and other community members, did you start to feel a strong connection to Michigan?
Yes, I do feel a very strong connection to Michigan at this point, especially so I'm a runner, and when I do think that there is a visceral spiritual reaction that humans have when they are immersed in nature, right? So there is something about nature that I think makes us think bigger and feel smaller, right? And that's a really good way to open up a conversation with God, right? So when I go on my runs on the dirt roads surrounding my home, it's on a typical morning, maybe I'll see one car, and I'll see things like bald eagles, kingfishers, green herons, foxes, deer. And so I'm just surrounded by this immaculate verdant right now, right? Because it's not always like that place. And so that's one of the ways that Michigan, I have connected so deeply with Michigan. In fact, sometimes, my daughter just joined dance, so I'm running her in and out on a weekly basis now. And I can see this happening to Ludington. I mean, with my son, who's 3, he's going to eventually join something, and then we're going to be busing him back and forth. And so sometimes I even think, gosh, we should just move in town. We should just move in Ludington. And then I'll drive by a house that's for sale, and I think, no, like there's just this like, no, like the runs are so pretty out where I live, and the houses are so close here, and they're not even that close compared to Houston. And so I think I've been properly brainwashed in terms of the gorgeous setting of rural West Michigan. And I think in terms of ways that I have changed and ways that I have changed in terms of seeing rural West Michigan, that's also changed dramatically. I think I used to see rural America as one thing, right? So even though I come from this family of Southern Baptists, they're very well educated, they're very urban people, right? So I from a lot of my life, I saw rural America as kind of one note, as probably all like white Christian conservative and flyover flyover zone, right? It's getting from here to there and don't bother stopping. So when I was in this position where I had accepted a proposal from a guy who had accepted a job in rural West Michigan, and we were going to be setting down roots, I was sort of forced into discovering it. And what I discovered is that rural America is not one thing. There might not be other Jews here, but there are lots of people here that for whatever reason don't fit rural America on paper, right? Don't fit the white Christian conservative kind of what you'd expect. And that's been a joy to discover. So, you know, I have found one other Jewish friend here because I published this book. She found me, but I have, I know like a small collective of Buddhists here, and there's a guy at work who's from Bangladesh. And so there are lots of people here, and I could go on, but there are lots of people here who for whatever reason don't fit that rural America on paper. And so it has totally upended what I thought about rural America before moving here.
Did you find any similarities between yourself and some of the biblical Jewish heroines as you were adjusting to Jewish life? I think the ones that come to mind to me that I remember are the stories of Ruth and Naomi, being that they also were not Jewish.
Yeah, that's right. And I would say Ruth. So oddly enough, and I talk about this in the book, I'm named for my like evangelizing Southern Baptist grandmother who was named Mary Ruth, right? But she gave me the right middle name, right? So I really do feel a kinship with the biblical Ruth, the first convert, and all of the rural. She lived a rural life, you know. She was going to the threshing floor, right? She was like gathering wheat, right? It was a time in history where Jews were farmers. And so I feel this kinship with her because I think she kind of was like very bold for her time, and, you know, for that time to say, your God is my God and your people are my people, and don't you leave me behind. That's radical then, and in some ways it remains a radical act, right? Especially within Judaism, which has a very mixed response to converts, right? So I do feel that kinship with Ruth.
What lessons and teachings from Judaism did you find sustained you in your adjustment to living in rural Michigan? And was it again those stories of Ruth that helped you?
Yes, so the stories of Ruth, but also this idea of, well, a couple of concepts. So I'm sure people here know about the concept of tikkun olam, right? So mending the world while living in it. And this is a big deal in Reform Judaism, right? And this is something that my sponsoring rabbi hit home at every step of the way. What are you doing to make the world a better place? So for instance, I try to do this within my teaching. So rather than, well, let me back up. We're sort of at a point in America right now where everything's knee-jerk, everything is runs off of such high emotions that people aren't doing the actual work of slowing down and dissecting and taking a good hard look at various news sources, at the way that their family members are responding to various events. And so rather than telling my students what to believe, what I try to do in my teaching is to say, slow down, right? Examine the sources. Take a look at the claim here. Is it a valid claim, or is it operating off of faulty underlying assumptions, right? So that is one way that I actually bring Judaism into my life as a faculty member. And of course, also the idea of going through those dayanos, right? Thinking about points of gratitude and practicing that not only in my own life, but with my children at this point, right? So that's a little bit, those are some of the things that I've really latched onto.
Switching gears a little, in your book, you mentioned the story of Josephine Earp, who I had no idea until I read your book was Jewish, and the kinship that you felt with her in reading her story as you were going through Replica Dodge. Could you sort of expand more on that for us?
Yeah, so Josephine Sarah Marcus Earp was born to Prussian immigrants in New York, and she ran away when she was 17 years old. Okay, so that's like the first point of connection that I have with her, is she's like fleeing, right? Fleeing this life that she's known at 17, which was interestingly, you know, when I was 17, I had graduated from high school a year early. I'd been accepted at the University of Houston, and that was I accepted the university that was closest to my physical home with my parents, but I actually wasn't still living at home. But that was the year my parents said, "See you later." You know, like they moved across the nation, so they sort of left me behind. And so trying to make being that point of separation, right, at 17. Also the fact that Josephine Sarah Marcus Earp chose to marry a non-Jewish guy, right? And probably like one of the most decidedly non-Jewish men of American history, Wyatt Earp, like this famous Western gunslinger. And you know, I often wonder about what did that marriage look like? And so much of her life and Wyatt's life is so enmeshed in myth. You know, historians have real problems with some of the claims made in her biography. And so we don't, she's kind of this shadowy figure, but we do know some facts about her. And I often find myself wondering about just like the quieter moments where she thought about her Jewish family, where she thought about like what being Jewish meant to her. But I think one thing that's interesting is that she and Wyatt, so again, a fact that most people don't know, Wyatt Earp is buried in a Jewish cemetery right next to Josephine and surrounded by her Jewish family in Colma, California. So I think that tells you something about this woman of the Wild West and her life, and also her husband, that he was buried there.
And you just said, like Josephine, you fell in love with a non-Jewish man when you were newly converted to the religion. Did you feel you had to do some reconciling, having just become Jewish and falling in love with somebody who wasn't?
Yes. And in fact, you know, from the reading that I just did, that was present from the moment that, you know, I first went to the rabbi, and he told me almost immediately, interfaith is a contested issue within Judaism. And I thought about Joe. And of course, we were 6 months into a great relationship. I didn't know at that point that I would marry him. But I will say, there are some benefits to being married. So he's not Jewish, right? But he is also not something else, right? It's not as if I'm married to, I'm a Jewish woman who's married to a devout Lutheran who's pushing his own kind of religious, cultural upbringing, right? Joe, more than anything else, you know, he's a physics professor. He believes in science, and he was raised as a Catholic, but has since he's thrown that cultural religious identity across his shoulder and just kept on trucking forward. And so to him, though, it's not something that is like a difficult relationship. He sees the two as living side by side, just like us, right? So I think that if you asked my children, they would say, my mother is Jewish and my father is a physics professor. It's not, my mother is Jewish, but my father is a physics professor and he's constantly trying to undermine what my mom's doing. No, I think what I get from Joe is a lot of support in terms of raising kids as Jews. But interestingly, just the other day, speaking of children who get to a point of their life where they start asking thought-provoking questions. So we were driving around and my daughter Rivka said, out of nowhere, she said, Mom, I know I am Jewish. I know Linus, her baby brother, is Jewish. I know you're Jewish, but is Dad Jewish? And so she asked my husband this question when he got home, and he totally punted it to me. He just said, well, go ask your mom. So she knows something's a little bit different about Joe, about her dad. But thankfully, even though he is not Jewish, he has been fully supportive, and more than anything, he's a science dude. So that's as close as a spiritual identity as I can determine in my husband. Which, if you're a Reformed Jew, you love science, right? Like, science is fully, yeah. Let's sit down and have dinner, science. So.
Changing gears a little bit, in your book, you also speak about the fact, and you touched on this a bit tonight, that you knew from a young age that you weren't, you didn't identify as Southern Baptist or Methodist. And later on really understood that, your spirituality and your spiritual identity were Jewish. Did you feel a need to sort of come out to your friends and your neighbors as, I'm Jewish now? Or, did you not say anything to them? And when you did speak to them about it, were they accepting of this?
Yes. So my sponsoring rabbi, Alana Schwartz, actually encouraged me to write a letter to my family when my conversion was about to happen, a month or so away. She said, you need to tell pretty much everybody in your family this news. And I did. But interestingly, after my conversion took place, I didn't want to tell people that I had converted. And so it was this weird thing where, and even after my well, actually, this is about a week before my conversion, my rabbi said, you shouldn't, you're not really a convert anymore. You are going to be a Jew. You are just a Jew for the rest of your life, right? And so in a way, it felt like something like, oh, maybe I don't want to be a convert. But actually, in this book was the first time that I really almost became comfortable with the idea. I looked at the work that I had done, this, like, the emotional and the spiritual and the mental work that I had done to become Jewish. And I thought for the first time, this is not something to keep to myself. This is something to share with the world, because so many people are in that. They do convert to Judaism, and maybe they don't feel confident in that in some parts of their conversion, or they feel like they don't really fit within Judaism. So not only did I need to come out to my family, right? I almost felt this need to say, yeah, I'm a Jew, right? But I also converted, and that's okay, right? Because I've had some various experiences where there's been some, well, I get the distinct impression that I will never be Jewish enough for some people. So it's both sides of coming out, if that makes any sense.
It does. Finally, what advice do you have for people in a similar situation to yours, whether they're contemplating making a big identity change or finding themselves, out of their element, out of their comfort zone?
Yeah. Well, I keep a journal, right? This is how this memoir started. I was just trying to figure out my next move. I was deeply uncertain. And I told myself, like, I'm just going to start recording all the weird stuff that happens to me on a daily basis here in rural West Michigan. And that's what eventually became this memoir, right? So writing actually forces us to slow down and to lean into those feelings of discomfort, which is, it can be entirely cathartic, right? So keep a journal. The other thing that I would say is do what you can with what you have where you're at, right? Which is a quote from Teddy Roosevelt, right? So maybe you can't, and this is, again, this applies to COVID, right? Do what you can with what you have where you're at. And you might not have a lot of resources. I don't have a lot of, I don't have a lot of other Jewish friends here or a Jewish community here to speak of. What I can do is keep Shabbat. What I can do is sing to my kids in Hebrew, so that when they grow up and they go and eventually join a congregation and we start traveling more back and forth between services, they recognize those songs. And I think probably the last piece of advice that I would give is that people fear these decisions. They fear this sort of coming out, right? But I think if you've got good people in your life, they probably love you way more than you even know. And they will find a way, if they're a decent human being, they will find a way to continue to love you and support you in your new path. So I think that, yeah, I think that's what I would say. Keep a journal, do what you can with what you have where you're at, and just know that the good people in your life love you and will accept you afterwards. So that's what I've got so far.
Well, thank you so much for coming here and doing this program with us tonight. It was really, really wonderful. And I think I can speak for all of us when I say you're so engaging, and we really, really enjoyed reading and hearing about your experience. And we look forward to hearing, what your next few chapters are.
Oh, thank you so much, Kara. And thank you all for attending tonight. Again, it means the world to me. And I hope to write another book. We'll see if my kids ever go back to school. So I don't know, we'll see. It's all up in the air again. But I do have one final request, which is that if you have read the book and loved it and have something good to say about it, please leave a positive review on Amazon. It really does. Once you reach 25 positive reviews on Amazon, your book becomes far more visible to the greater world. I don't know why that happens. It's part of their algorithm, but my editor was like, "You're going to speak to this group tonight. Make sure you mention that you should put a positive review on Amazon if you've read this book." So that's my editor really speaking through me. But again, thank you all for the support and the attendance tonight. And I look forward to hopefully giving another one of these in the future for another book.
We would love that. Thank you, everybody, again. And we look forward to seeing everybody, hopefully, on August 25th for Are There Really Jews Up There? Jewish Life in Northern Michigan.
There are.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you so much,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Have a good
Thank
evening.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.